This is Social Europe Podcast. We are dedicated to strengthening democracy by discussing the most pressing political, economic, and social issues of our time. So welcome and enjoy the conversation.
Hello, Colin. Thank you very much indeed for joining me today on Social Europe Podcast on the important issue of social democracy and how it relates to social groups, societal groups, and identity politics, as well as what a transformative politics could look like. And to get us going against the backdrop of the current political discussions, you've recently produced a sort of very strongly academic book on how the development of social groups in Western democracies have evolved, and what is the main finding of your research, and are these social groups as they are today still a good way to attach politics to?
Well, hello, Henning. Yeah, good to talk to you again. Historically, we've seen the Western democracy, well, certainly the Western European democracies. The United States is a bit different. We've seen them as rooted really in politics about class and to some extent about religion and social values. And that really gave us the identities which people saw themselves as related to political parties. Emerging out of the struggles around those very things in the first half of the 20th century, that terrible first half. Now, obviously, with time, those identities wore out. Partly the economic structure changed so that the occupational classes became less and less clear. Religion declined in Europe, and anyway, the churches began to take up fewer strong political positions, and the generations that had experienced those first decades after the Second World War started to die. And so necessarily and naturally, all those identities declined. They're still at the heart of a lot of politics. It hasn't completely disappeared, and most elections will be at some point about more equality or less equality, more social policy or lower taxes. That's still there. That's still there. But it has declined in importance, and for quite a while, from the sort of 1990s onwards, politics was more about parties trying to find groups they could appeal to in a less profound way, a more transactional way, perhaps, less deeply rooted in identity. And that was going along. That could survive. There's no reason why we always have to have politics with very strong identities. But then two sets of things happened. First, the promise of post-war politics, that you would always get a little bit richer than you were the year before. That suffered enormous crises, with the financial crisis 2008 and then with COVID. And so no longer was the system promising to look after people. Then we also had, in a number of countries, most countries actually, major acts of terrorism, nearly always from an Islamic source. And this then laid the grounds for a new alternative basis of political identity. And that was nationalism, Islamophobia, a rejection of outsiders. And this has proved to be it's not overwhelmingly powerful. I mean, it very rarely gets to more than a quarter of the population, but that's the same as, or slightly more than, the traditional parties are getting. So what's happened was the old system was wearing out, and then a series of shocks have opened space for a new powerful identity, a nation, xenophobia, dislike of foreigners generally.
I mean, the interesting point you make about, for instance, inequality and taxation and these sort of things. they work, I would argue, also largely independent of the coherence of social groups. If you define the beneficiaries and the people who you would like to tax in a way, that it's about winners and losers. So the traditional working class, the industrial working class, was rather homogeneous. Today's economy is very sort of colorful. You have self-employed people, you have employees. What was traditionally understood as the sort of the factory worker or the sort of the traditional worker in the industry. I mean, I think my argument would be that has been sort of not hollowed out, but society has become more diverse. However, you can still attach a lot of that sort of traditional meaning if you look at inequality in terms of power, inequality in terms of economic participation, and in economic output, as you rightly said, because the promise that the next generation, you said every year things get a little bit better, but on a more fundamental level, I would argue, the promise that the next generation will always be better off than the last one. From everything we've seen in opinion polls, that seems to be have eroded completely. So maybe the argument would be, no matter whether there is a coherence still in these social groups, the fundamental conflict lines can be transformed into a more varied society.
Yeah, yes, definitely. Do the sort of game that economists do with an oversimplified model of society. First, let's assume there are two kinds of political issue. There are material ones, like taxation, welfare, and there are cultural ones, religion, race, culture war issues. These two variables, which have always been there in politics. And you assume that people take up generous or mean positions on each of these two. So they're either welcoming inclusive attitudes or they're exclusionary attitudes. So you've got a 2-by-2 model. Now, let's assume a very, very simple society in which you get quite a large number of people who are highly educated and therefore relatively rich. And then another huge group of people who are poorly educated and are poor. Now, you might assume that both of those groups have an incentive to be mean in general, but there will be a tendency, and it's only a tendency, for the more educated to have more expansive views of the world, to be less tied to small groups, to be more internationalist. And so we might expect the educated to be more tolerant and welcoming on cultural issues. But because they're relatively wealthy, they might well be more mean on material issues. Except that there are attitude transfers. If people have taken up a certain position on some issues, they're quite likely to spread those to other ones. Now look at the other side, the less educated population. This is exactly the other way around. Because they're poorly educated, they're less likely, not impossible, less likely to have culturally inclusive and expansionary views. But because they're relatively poor, they are more likely to want a welfare state and redistribution. And then some of them, but will transfer between the two of those things. So you've got these two groups are sort of mirror images of each other. And parties seeking coalitions need to work at coalitions that include both these groups. And so it used to be the case that in general, social democratic parties had a less educated electorate than conservative parties. Though there was always a bourgeois, sort of Cateda socialist and groups of left-wing middle-class people. And the same on the other side. There were always working-class Catholics and social conservatives. But these things are more stark now. It seems to me coalitions that parties try to build need much more than in the past to be aware that they need to be finding voters in these two groups, these two different groups at the educational level. And alongside this, it's very interesting that the voting for what, if you can identify centre-left parties, voting for them is increasingly of a more highly educated population than vote for the right. There is this the bad news for Social Democrats is they've been losing the great mass, the larger number of relatively low-educated people. On the other hand, they're gaining among the educated, and the educated are gaining in size.
Yeah, and this is, I think, related to the discussion that we've had for the last sort of 10 to 12 years, which is how you put a communitarian perspective and a cosmopolitan perspective together. I mean, it seems to me, the common ground is basically, and now we see a backlash against globalization, and this is not surprising because it's been long predicted in a way that if this openness, globalization produces such inequality. And, you saw that with Branko Milanovic's famous elephant graph and others, right? So that at one point the political support for this will just erode, right? So and now we're in the middle of sort of a deconstruction of also the positive aspects of globalization, because social democrats as well were never able to basically set up a distribution mechanism that would spread the benefits of globalization more widely. So, and that's the economic argument, and as you know, Michael Sandel has put the sort of the cultural element there as well, where meritocracy has been one of the ideas. So you skill yourself up, right? There's only one upward mobility, and if you skill yourself up, you're likely to do well in this new economy. And hence you made it. And the flip side of the coin is, if you don't make it, it's your own fault, right? And you don't deserve any sort of social status that comes. Basically, you're being seen also culturally as a loser. So, and these kind of forces that have been built up for several decades were never really moderated successfully. And now I think in the old Polanyi idea, we see in terms of the double movement, the pendulum swinging back fully against it. So, and it seems to me that one of the ways to reconcile this is to build the redistribution mechanisms alongside sort of the cultural preconditions to marry these two perspectives.
Yeah. So one of the big problems with the way globalization was introduced was that the entry into the trading regime of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, was only dependent on demonstrating that you hadn't got excessive state subsidies and you were entering the free market. There was nothing there about workers' rights. Now, had the WTO imported into its membership criteria the main workers' rights of the International Labour Organization's charter, then globalization would have progressed more slowly, because China and other countries would not have been allowed to enter the system unless they'd started to reform their labour rights. So their prosperity would have progressed more slowly. It would have happened, but more slowly. Of the impact on the Western nations would have been delayed, because these countries wouldn't have been able to enter the system until they'd improved a lot of rights, and until their costs had therefore become higher. So the impact on Western manufacturing workers would have been slower. So there would have been much more time to adjust. Instead, what happened was that in the sort of neoliberal atmosphere of the 1990s, when these things were developing, the Western nations, whether they were conservatives or social democrats, were rather wanting to move away from labor rights. They wanted to deregulate labor markets. And they thought wages were going to be stagnant and not rising very fast, but goods could become cheaper. So yeah, your wages might not go up next year, but you'll be able to buy a pair of jeans for €3 instead of €20. Because they're being made by starving workers in Bangladesh. So there was a kind of devilish deal done, really, that said Western consumer, the Western voter is a consumer. They should see themselves as consumers, and they should be interested in low prices. They should not see themselves as workers with rights to protect. And that was really a kind of consensus. I doubt if anyone ever said it openly, but it certainly was the consensus that gave us globalization. And it could all have been done differently, but it wasn't. And then we end up with Donald Trump claiming to be the great defender of workers' rights, when actually he doesn't accept any of the rights in the ILO Charter.
Yeah, I think this is, you might be able to explain it with this sort of seeping sort of economization of everything. We talked about sort of how politics has become or became transactional in the 1990s, trying sort of to identify voter groups, and sort of that's a demand that is just there. It's an exogenously determined demand, and we just serve it, right? So, and the same is true for what you just said, right? So globalization was that was actually documented. I think Rebecca Schroeder once said, either we reform or we are being reformed, right?
Yeah.
So the idea was globalization is something happening to you. It is not a political space to be molded and to be looked at in political terms, right? So that they can shape globalization the way also you just said, you could have enshrined labor rights, and maybe then the WTO would not be in the position it is today, right? So, and but it was seen as largely exogenous, as globalization as well as sort of voter preferences. And that has, my interpretation is this has led to complete sort of decline of politics in a sense. Because if you ask the simple question, not just in Germany or the UK, but probably in most Western European countries, what do social democratic parties stand for? You don't get an answer, right? Because people don't really know what social democratic party stands for. And that to me is a logical consequence. If you've been involved in this transactional politics, where you basically try to serve a predetermined demand, and you try to, all you do in an election manifesto is to cobble this together in a new way, right? You lose the transformative idea of social democracy, which was, we want to transform society into something better, right? So we look at a political destination and work back from there, and that has completely gone. And that's exactly, it seems to me, what the populists are doing. They're proposing a dystopy, right? They're making people believe that they don't have to change in the face of, climate change and all these big global issues. And basically our vision of the future is actually the past, right? So we can go back to the 1950s. Nobody will ask you about anything. You can, we won't bother you with climate change. We won't bother you with anything else. You also see these sort of cultural backlashes. Wives, apparently traditional female roles is basically rolling back sort of emancipation and all the progress we've made in terms of women's rights, right? So it's basically very sort of emotional, but it's a transformative vision. The transformation is we transform back into what we had before. Whereas, with social democrats, you get a laundry list of policies that are not connected, that are not adding up to anything in particular. And I give you one example from the recent election campaign in Germany that also chimes with what's happening in the UK. When there was the peak in asylum applications, right? So the chancellor made the argument during the election campaign, well, we are on the right track because asylum applications are declining, right? So it didn't work. It didn't change the issue in any way. Why? Because it's not a numbers game, right? So the underlying feeling was not that we have a number X now and we need to bring it down to number Y and then the problem is solved. But the fundamental assumption is the state is not in control of the borders. Things are just happening to us, and we need to establish a sort of control, right? So, and to my mind, I do buy this argument about control, but you can make a very different argument for why you need it, right? So the right-wing populists here, as well as in the UK, for instance, say they want control because they want to shut the door, right? But there is an argument to be made to create control in the system to retain the general acceptance of openness, right? So,
Yes.
and to my mind, what social democrats have to do and haven't been doing in recent decades is not, being scared of that idea of right-wing populists, what they put forward, their transformation, and then follow their road in one way or the other, hesitantly, because you don't have anything else to offer. But the only answer to my mind is you have to be bold and create your own vision, which is significantly different from what the right-wing populists offer, and then enter in what Habermas called democratic polarization. How do you see this?
Yes, because although you're quite right, there is this very strong emotional charge to the right-wing populism. It's also very rational. If you are a white male, you see a world of shrinking opportunity. You think you see a world of shrinking opportunities, or at least your life could be made a lot easier if immigrants, ethnic minorities, and women could be kept out. And so you just want them out. My life would be easier if there was far less competition, for material competition, cultural competition. And so it's a very rational appeal in a certain way. Now, one of the things that we have to do to counter that is actually to say, it's to point to the number of areas in life where we need cooperation. We need cooperation within a society. We need cooperation between societies. Because the notion that it just leave me with more of my own and I can get on with it, that ignores the fact that the railways can't work unless you're willing to spend taxation money on improving the railways. That we need infrastructure. We need to build up our towns, and that needs collective activity. It can't be done through the market. It can't be done by individuals. And also climate change, because one of the very sad things of since the years since COVID, is that as people have felt more and more pressured economically, they've started to reject the arguments about climate change. And this has to come back, not as an argument saying you've got to therefore pay all these things, but that we are in grave danger unless we pull together. And it's no good saying we can do this as our nation all by itself. Environmental damage doesn't respect passports. It doesn't respect national borders. You can't control your border against it. So a very strong argument needs to be made that we need cooperation. We need each other, and we need others. And I think that sort of openness that is about cooperation, is about collective action, is probably it's the most rational path for a centre-left politics. It deals with some of our old enemies, with the issues about social policy versus taxation. That's still bundled up in there. It includes all these new issues, and it appeals to the better part of human beings. It's an appeal that says, we're not going to appeal to you in your mean-minded narrowness, because that's not even going to help yourself in the long run. We appeal to you as a citizen, a member of a community, and a member of a world of international cooperation.
And I think that's a fundamentally critical point. I mean, how do you create the conditions for society to pull together? How do you create the conditions for strangers to become fellow citizens? That's one of the areas I'm looking into at the moment. I'll give you one example. The idea of social infrastructure, so that the physical spaces where people actually can meet, not in online chat rooms, but physical interaction, which is to a large extent also a precondition of a functioning democracy, right? So if you take the Habermas argument of deliberative democratic legitimacy seriously, then it means you have to have a certain infrastructure, a certain democratic and social infrastructure where this discourse can actually take place. And if you take the example of Germany, over recent decades, we've seen this kind of social infrastructure deteriorate in many respects. In local councils, for instance, they had they were given more and more tasks they had to do, whereas the sort of that which squeezed the budget for swimming pools, libraries, and all the rest. So the financial basis for that kind of social infrastructure, particularly at the local level, I think the local level is where it needs to start, because that's where people actually meet. It's not the national politics; it's the local, it's the neighborhoods, and that was part of the story in the west of Germany. In the east, arguably, it was even worse, because of a lot of the infrastructure was attached to the firms and companies in the GDR, and as they were privatized, that kind of social infrastructure disappeared completely. So in that sense, there is a lack of the physical precondition, really, to I completely agree with the argument. How you bring society together and retrain that idea that we're better off if we pull together. The only way we can solve a lot of these collective action problems is by working together. But I think probably we'll have to start at a very, very deep level to create the physical spaces again for society to develop.
Yes, and it does. I always have in mind the Russian Matryoshka doll, where there's a series of dolls all identical inside each other, and that's how we have to see ourselves as citizens. That we're members of a local community, we're members of sort of rather larger regional communities, we're members of our nations, and then we have to reach out beyond the nation state. And this is where European Union membership is an enormous help. But it certainly does build up from the bottom. There's a kind of force opposition between cosmopolitanism and localism, communitarianism. It needs to be seen as something that is an interrelated set of wholes. These levels are not set against each other, they are interdependent. It was very interesting, during what was probably the greatest period in the history of the European Union was the presidency of Jacques Delors, because he understood that a very Polanyian approach he had, that he was making markets. He's the presiding over the construction of the single market. So therefore, you're going to have more and more market. But alongside that, he strengthened the social links of the Union. Important roles given to trade associations, to trade unions in particular, to local government, to regional governments. And it used to be the case. I remember when the government of Catalonia at first set up an office in Brussels, the Spanish state said this was an act of treason, and they forbade it. But now it's absolutely routine. Every single region throughout Europe has an office in Brussels. So, because Brussels addresses and tries to relate to the whole structure of society, and that we have to see that notion of a series of collectivities that cooperate with each other up and down and accept that they need each other. It shouldn't be impossible to convince people that, in a very basic way, that cooperation is a good idea, and it's a good idea to devote resources to making your town attractive, to making facilities attractive. And it's very interesting if you look at where the votes of the two most opposed groups in terms of social characteristics are Greens and the new right-wing populists. And they inhabit totally different worlds. Greens tend to be found in large cities with very dynamic economies and with a good urban environment. The main bases of populists are the places that have been left behind, either ex-industrial places that are just deteriorating, or places that are just left behind. They're not particularly poor, they're just not part of the modern world. So there is an important issue there too.
Yeah, and if you take these two poles as ideal types, in the Max Weber sense, how would you start to build a common ground?
By stressing the need for looking at looking beyond our individual selves and our pocketbooks, looking out to us members of communities. And we want our community to be both socially and physically good. And we need to care about the state of the environment we're living in, the environment in every sense of that word, and building up from there. and it includes the welfare state. It includes the old social democratic agenda. It doesn't need to get rid of that. It includes the notion of social policy, of the fact that we are all dependent on each other and we all need each other. We need the service, the support of society, and you build up from there. So it's part. Yeah.
Yeah, and it seems to me that the redistribution inequality issue could be one of the key elements as well. Because if you look at the development in recent years, right? So I saw somewhere, I didn't verify the numbers, but they intuitively sounded plausible, was that 10 years ago, Elon Musk was worth 10 billion and now he's worth 400 billion. Right, and whereas the sort of general median wage growth is nowhere near. So we have an exponential development at the top and a linear one at best further down, which basically means the dynamics of inequality are becoming worse every year. And whereas in previous decades, you could say basically, oh, it's just a jealousy argument or things like that. You now have very clear empiric evidence, if you look just at the US, how that money can buy political influence, cultural influence, and so on and so forth. So I think for the vast majority of people, and this is a role for the state, is reining in that power and redistributing some of that wealth because it's not earned in any meaningful meaning of the term. That seems to be, I think, one of the areas where people could also rally around. Provided that, but some reactionary forces are not as successful as they used to be in saying, or basically they mean you. No, we're not meaning the person that just inherits a house from his parents or her parents, right? So it's the people who are the billionaires or 10 million plus, right? So there's a clear gap, and that gap has widened in recent years. So it seems to me that this might be one of the areas that could help to rebuild a new social contract and rebuild such a consensus.
Yes, certainly. And now the United States is an extreme case, actually. But nevertheless, there are similar tendencies in European countries. And it is a very, very small elite that is doing very well. As artificial intelligence begins to bite, that is going to get worse and worse. And so although there might be divisions between sort of middle-educated, middle-income people and lower-educated, relatively poor people, the divisions between them are becoming very small, really, especially as the returns to education get less. And so that argument needs to be taken up. Well, you see, something very strange happened again in the 1990s and thereafter, in that inequality was recognized as an issue. But the neoliberal interpretation of inequality, which was shared by social democrats like Schroeder and Blair, was inequality was disadvantages for women, for ethnic minorities, for disabled people. That was inequality. And equality was giving people from those categories a chance. What you didn't talk about was economic inequality. That was just, no, we're not interested in that. It's not a relevant thing. And that, of course, did a lot of harm. It enabled the right-wing populists to find their support among white working class males, which they did do and have done. And it pretended inequality didn't matter. And that is then also the curious thing now, because the centre-left and the centre-right are frightened to criticize the very wealthy. It's been left to the populist right to complain about elites. Only they define, and sometimes, because this is a big division within the United States, there are some part of Trump's crowd for whom people like Musk are part of the elite enemy, but then also that elite enemy is also part of Trump's coalition, and in fact includes himself. So they've managed to convince everybody that the elite is some kind of cultural liberal thing, that and to detach that from inequalities of wealth. Now, if there is an anti-elitist mood around, then surely it's the centre-left that has more of a chance of making something serious of that. than it is the extreme right.
Yeah, I
I've
think
seen what's just happened in Austria, where they discovered that the richest group in the parliament are the FPÖ. And the ones who complain about elites are actually the elite.
yeah. Well, the same applies to Nigel Farage, right? He's not. It's not
Yes.
your typical working class lad, right?
Yes, yes. Well, he went up to address some steel workers where there was a fear that a plant was to be closed, and he said, "I used to work in the metal industry." He
Yeah, it's
worked
a metal
as
trader in London.
metal trader. That's right, a trader on the stock exchange. But he managed just to pretend he worked as a steel worker.
Okay, well, that's actually quite a quite a courageous line. Yeah, I also worked in the metal industry because I was trading metal. There you go. I mean, I remember this economic policy argument. I remember very well from the 1990s and the 2000s, because economic inequality was basically redefined as an issue about poverty,
Yes,
right? So
poverty.
they lifted the poverty level, but left everything above untouched. So you had issues like the minimum wage and other policies that were addressing the very bottom end, but they did nothing really to really address the growing gaps and stretches in the distribution above.
Yeah, and then there's the danger that those people therefore think, well, the only people speaking for me are the right-wing populists. That can be taken away from them. That can be taken away.
And if you go to one of the thorny issues that are being debated, and where we see very different directions now being taken, is migration. How would you frame a progressive migration policy, or say a social democratic migration policy? Because maybe that's a better term now again than progressives, right? So
yes. Well, obviously, we want our societies to be welcoming. We want our fellow citizens to treat someone from a very different culture as a fellow human being and not as some kind of monster. On the other hand, if immigrants come from much poorer societies than our own, and if they come in large numbers, then there really is a challenge to wage levels and levels of working conditions. And so it seems to me that countries have every right to regulate their openness to immigrants from countries from very, very, very poor backgrounds. And you can do this in various ways of a sort of green card type systems. Now, it's interesting that the opening of the single market, to the open European labour market to people in the new countries to the east, caused some friction. There were these complaints about the Polish plumber in France from the Front National, and most French people said, great, we've got a plumber now. The only country that actually reacted in an extreme way to Eastern immigration was Britain, which left the European Union about it, as a result of which immigration from the rest of the world, from far more remote cultures to Britain, is at a higher level than immigration from the East ever was. Partly because immigration from the East are from countries with very small families. If they can go home and visit their families easily, they can be seasonal workers who go home, or if they bring their families, it's a small number of people. We've closed all them down. Instead, we've opened our arms to the rest of the world who have large families who need to bring them over, or they'll never see them again. And so Brexit increased immigration. And it seems to me that across Europe, the issue of East to West immigration is no longer an issue, partly because most of the leaders of far-right movements are in countries that send immigrants to Western Europe. But so it's about people coming from very poor countries, and there you do have to have some regulation coming in to you must ensure people come in when there are skill shortages, or also you need to understand we do want immigration because this is very difficult to get people to understand, although they should, that immigrants improve the diversity of your culture and of your economy. And innovation and growth and novelty come out of things that are different coming together again. And so there's an argument, yeah, it needs to be regulated, but you do want immigration, and you should welcome it and see it as something that's going to invigorate the society.
Yeah, I would argue
there's a separate issue of illegal immigration, but perhaps that's not for today.
Yeah, I mean there's a fundamental lie basically at the heart of Brexit, right? So and that is not being addressed, and that's why it's becoming it's not getting easier. It's becoming a more and more thorny issue. I mean, the reason why it was all about taking back control, right? And there's a fundamental difference, as I also said in a talk recently, between, say, the German and the UK debate. Even the AfD in Germany does not question freedom of movement, which was at the heart of Brexit.
Yes.
Right. So therefore, the argument lies a bit differently. But the reason why EU migrants, such as myself, I was one of them, were replaced by non-EU migrants is simply because you need them in the labour market and elsewhere. Right. And the fundamental truth, it seems to me, is that you simply cannot improve the NHS in any meaningful way, or kickstart growth if you don't accept that this is part of the deal.
Yeah.
Right. So there's a contradictory argument. It seems to me that progressives are caught in that. On the one hand, you promise economic recovery and progress. On the other hand, you peddle without trying to explain the connections to the gut feeling of that needs to be done with just the white working class. I mean, if you look at the blue labor arguments now, I mean, Morris Glassman was an old colleague of mine at university, right? So, and they move way to the right now, right? I mean, there's no way that you can just rebuild an economy simply on industry with white British. It simply won't work like that. That's a recipe for economic decline. Right. So, I think you really need to make that argument, but politicians in Britain seem to be afraid that was one of the logical consequences of Brexit. So, and that's why I'm so keen to try to make the argument here in Germany. I mean, in Germany, it seems to me that the issue is, as I indicated, is asylum. Right? Freedom of movement is not being questioned. We also have an immigration law, green card type system. So that is not being questioned. I think at the heart of the problem is, as you know, Germans like it ordered, right? So that there seems to be no order when it comes to asylum. Yeah. So, and the question to me seems to be, in order to maintain the general openness that we need, and Germany is an immigration country as much as the UK, right? And for economic development and for cultural richness, that needs to be maintained. But to me, one of the preconditions seems to be that a sort of orderly system needs to be developed. I don't have the answer yet, but it's sometimes and also it's not as easy as just to say just fight the causes of refugees, right? So you can make the argument for climate change, it's fine, but the major waves in recent decades have been because of wars. And, of course, what can you do to prevent, how could we have prevented Russia invading Ukraine? We tried it. Olaf Scholz tried it, right? Yeah. So, and it wasn't possible. So you have to deal with a system where you have spikes, right? Yeah. And that meet limited physical infrastructure in sort of local communities and so on and so forth. So I don't have the answer, but it seems to me that if you manage to create a policy that puts order in one way or the other, also by probably difficult compromises to that, but that helps maintain the general openness of a society. And that probably and that also relates to what you mentioned, to maintain standards. If immigration is used to drive down standards at the lower end and reduce the your own relative position, then it's you won't be able to expect widespread support. But if you can actually, build a redistribution system that makes sure everybody's better off, and you put order to the areas where the perception is it's being disorderly in recent years, then I think you can build support for general openness, which also is one of the areas that you mentioned, that because that's the empty space basically in the political in the quadrant that you mentioned. Nobody, because it's probably because it relates to so many different other dimensions. But if you can create sort of an idea of a controlled openness, that seems to be an area to move into.
Yeah, it's a paradox that to protect openness, you need some elements of closure. You need rules. Ohne Gesetz gibt es keine Freiheit. I mean, it's back to that that you can only. There's no such thing as openness in the sense of just a total free for all. I mean, it never ever works. That's anarchy. So there have to be rules, rule governed openness. It's not impossible to do.
No, but it, as you already said, but it seems to be a precondition, right? Because
it's preconditioned. Yeah.
So the general idea is sort of it cannot be free for all. Everybody just can come. I mean it can't work in that way. So but at the same time, it's also not, as you see, I would argue partially in Denmark, because they don't question freedom of movement, but they really want to deter people. And in the UK, Labour seems to be doubling down on that as well. I mean, to my mind, as an external observer now, it used to be taking back control about freedom of movement. Well, I can understand that argument if you identify freedom of movement as one of the problems, right? Yeah. So now there is control. And the result was it was a replacement of immigration, not a bringing down of the net migration figures. Now suddenly it's the boat people. I mean, it's just a few thousand people, right? So that's certainly not the main issue. And Britain is an island, right? So there is that. And then now the discourse in most recent weeks, and there was an interesting column also in the Financial Times by Robert Shrimsley, said that the white British is becoming a toxic term in the political discussion. And that seems to me to be at the core of why Social Democrats need to develop an alternative vision and put that, as an electoral offer in elections, rather than hesitantly walking down that route that, the right-wing populists are paving, for two fundamental reasons. First of all, the evidence really suggests it has never worked in electoral terms, so people vote for the original. So there's ample evidence for that. And the right-wing position is not static. And I think you can really see that in the UK case. Now it's really, at the end of the day, it's about, now it is now called sometimes the demographic crisis of the white British. So, and the end of this road is racism. Let's call it.
Well, yes, it latches into a very strange dialogue that mainly comes out of Hungary and Donald Trump's people, and that is the great replacement theory. The idea that why anyone should have this motive is never made clear. The argument is that the liberal elite, which of itself is actually white, the liberal elite wants to replace Christian white people with Muslims. And so they encourage abortion and contraception. They encourage women to go out to work so that they have fewer babies. So the idea is to suppress childbirth among the white population. And then the Islamic hordes can pour in and take over Europe, as they did in the 7th century. It's a crazy theory. I mean, Orban explicitly says it. Trump often says things like it. There are parts of the British far right that's well, not so far right actually, that say it, and it then has policies about encouraging childbirth, discouraging women from working. I mean, there's a whole load of things hang on, a whole load of very conservative causes hang on this notion that there's an attempt to replace the whites Christian population with Muslims. Why anyone should ever have such a policy is never made clear.
No. And we have things like that in Germany. Pegida, if you remember, a few years back, right? So
yes,
the end of the Occident.
Yeah.
So that was was in a similar vein. And but if you really, and that's the key thing. I mean, as I see, we are now developing two different models of where social democratic parties are traveling in two different directions, very different direction. The one is basically, I would call maybe hesitant accommodation of the path basically prepared by populists because of fear of, and I think that's still rooted in this transactional approach, because they see they have success to some extent in the polls, they have success in some local elections, and in order to steal their thunder, we need to offer it, right? So I think this is still very much rooted in this transactional approach to politics. That's what, certain constituency wants, and we'll offer it. And the other one that is developing is this transformational political approach, which basically argues there is no way a social democratic party should start following down that road, because if you look at what is at the end, it's certainly not social democracy. It's certainly nothing in terms of policy a social democratic party can reasonably argue for. So in that sense, we need to develop a new alternative politics and present a different vision. And, I went back to, Mehdi Hassan wrote a very good book about how to win every argument, and he went back to Aristotle, right? So, and the three elements that a good speech should encompass. Yes. Actually, it applies to politics in general. It's ethos, pathos, and logos, right? So you need to have believable and trustworthy people who are ethical, right, to present a certain direction believably and in a trustworthy manner. And then you have the pathos. You have to have that vision. You have to tell people, what is your idea of a society, right? Where do you want to go? If the right-wing populists want to go back to the 1950s, the 2050s should look like the 1950s, that's their vision. But, if our response is just logos, i.e., small-scale policies, that's not going to counteract it. So you need to have a different narrative, a different vision of society. And then the logos, but because that's where the right-wing populists are completely missing. They have no realistic policies in any shape or form. But, social democracy needs to have logos in the sense that you have a policy agenda that makes believable steps in the right direction, right? So, I looked at Barack Obama again most recently, his hope agenda, right? There was a very strong pathos element, right? So he really rallied people behind the idea of an America, where you have hope for better future and more opportunity. But the policy agenda, the financial crisis fell also into that. Yeah. But the policy agenda never made believable steps or backed this up in any meaningful way. Yeah. So then at some point it rang hollow. So you need to bring these three elements together, I assume, and we're now seeing really a sort of social democratic parties taking quite different routes.
Yeah, we ought to do more work in detail on the Danish case. And is Denmark just a case of slipping further and further towards the populist right, or have Danish Social Democrats found a point of stability that they can defend, but we're still holding true to their core values while conceding certain things on immigration? That's another interesting case to look at. This is from the centre right, not the centre left. Is what happened to the VVD in the Netherlands, where just before, this is the Liberal Party, that it's called a Liberal Party, it's really a Conservative Party. That before the last election, the leader of the party, who herself is a Turkish immigrant, said she saw no difficulty in building a coalition with Wilders, the right-wing populists. And whether she produced this effect or it was going to happen anyway, his vote shot up after she said that. And now they do find themselves in coalition together, a very uneasy coalition. And so it's interesting, have the Dutch conservative liberals been able to hold a respectable position while cooperating with Wilders? Have the Danish Social Democrats managed to hold a respectable position? I think these are two cases we should do more work on.
Absolutely, but to me the difference, one of the key questions is, how is a policy generated? Is it because you think based on your social democratic values that this is the position you should take in order to hold, right? As you call the holding position, but it becomes only a stable position in my view if it's basically derived as one of the policies contributing to wider vision and how to implement that. If it's derived out of a transactional in a transactional manner, i.e., you were pushed by the successes of other parties into that position, then it becomes very difficult to defend that position if the discourse is shifted again further to the right and the pressure builds. I think this is what we've seen with the Labour Party. So you should not be, of course, oblivious to your political context, but the way you basically generate your politics and generate your policy should be consistent with what you try to achieve in society, rather than mainly driven by external forces.
Yes. Two other interesting cases to look at when developing these agendas. The two countries in which the traditional left collapsed completely, which is France and the Netherlands. In both cases, they have constructed rather quickly coalitions running from Greens through to Socialists. The Dutch case, it seems to me, it looks very promising. It's under the leadership of Frans Timmermans, who's a very wise politician. It seems to me they are kind of developing a new centre-left, a new green social democratic concept. The French case is much more problematic because, as typical with French politics, that the groups that make up a coalition really never like each other. They stay as enemies, and so it'd be interesting. But in both cases, you've got these sort of green left coalitions and of parties. It'd be interesting seeing how they're both building or not building new politics.
And what is your explanation why they collapsed in the first place?
The French socialists have historically been weaker than the communists. This changed temporarily in the 1980s when Mitterrand, with enormous skill, took the communists into a coalition that killed them. And so the socialists got a kind of boost from that. They inherited the whole of the left. But then as the whole communist thing completely collapses, the historical weakness of French socialism becomes clear, I think, and it goes down to levels we've never seen in Germany or Britain or Austria. The Dutch case, the Dutch Labour Party has always been relatively weak because the industrialization of the Netherlands mainly took place in the Catholic South. And so the Catholic Party always represented a large part of the working class. And the Dutch Labour Party, the Netherlands never industrialized that far anyway. So the Dutch Labour Party never had that kind of base that the SPD or Labour Party or the Swedish Party ever had. So they were always sort of junior. So in a way, both of these were junior were parties that never had glorious periods. The other case, of course, a complete collapse in the West is Italy, but that's a more complex story, and they don't even get as far as the French in constructing coalitions. So they are the three cases in the West of where the centre-left collapsed. And then, of course, in Central and Eastern Europe, it never developed. I mean, it inherited the so-called left position of the old communist parties, and for quite a while held on to that vote while becoming very democratic. But they've just then got weaker and weaker, and in a way they've then been replaced by the new nationalists. And then with the very interesting case of Slovakia, where Smer, a party coming out of the left, actually, part of the left group in the European Parliament, has now moved right across to being alongside Orban and the far right.
There doesn't seem to be any programmatic or ideological mooring whatsoever.
No, nothing at all there. No.
Yeah. Okay, Colin. Okay. I mean, we've been going on for almost an hour. Thank you very much indeed. It was a great conversation, and some of the areas we identified need additional work, but at least we can see the contours of what is happening, and where the directions actually diverge quite significantly. Again, thank you very much. Thank you very much again. And talk to you soon.
Thank you for a really great discussion. Thank you. Bye.
This is Social Europe Podcast. We are dedicated to strengthening democracy by discussing the most pressing political, economic, and social issues of our time. So welcome and enjoy the conversation.